I was walking through an airport with my friend and coworker Micah when he mentioned something from a book he had been reading, that Gen X was the only generation so overly concerned with being authentic, with the concept of selling out. Not that authenticity as a desirable human quality isn't a thing, but authenticity to the core, as a hill to die on in a field of strangers, was really a thing. In one of my favorite podcasts, 60 Songs That Explain the 90s, the host Rob is talking about this in multiple episodes. One about Green Day's Basket Case, and another in a conversation with Courtney Love, about Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, and the 90s with its volcanic explosion of grunge and indie, and bands like those ones with iconic frontmen like those ones were riddled with the weight of what a sellout was. Yeah, I had to use air quotes around sellout. I won't get into it. This isn't a podcast about that. But in that airport, Micah and I totally understood. We're old enough to see ourselves shoulder to shoulder with millennials, Gen Z. We get it. They're right. Wayne's World was my favorite movie in 1992, and Mike Myers' character got up and walked off the set of his own indie basement cable TV show once the network bought it, changed it, and rather than be considered a sellout, he left. Nobody cares about a sellout anymore. We wouldn't have influencers if we did. But authenticity, we still seem to be holding court over authenticity. The more fabricated our surroundings become, the more important its value becomes. Our guest today is Chris Wynters. In Chris's career, he has fronted a very successful indie band, Captain Tractor, from the 90s, who continue to play. And if you happen to attend an Edmonton Oilers hockey game or a CFL game somewhere, you've probably heard The Last Saskatchewan Pirate and you didn't even know it. He has been the executive director for Alberta Music, a provincial music association, and he's currently the manager for acclaimed band The Dead South and for singer-songwriter Nissa. I've known Chris in all of those roles, wearing all of those hats. And he is the same exact guy in every situation, in every conversation. By Chris's own admission, it doesn't matter in this business how hard you sell it. If it isn't real and doesn't connect with someone in a real way, they ain't buying it. Authenticity still matters, perhaps more than ever. My name is Glen Erickson. This is Almost Famous Enough. Thank you for spending your time with us. This is Chris Wynters. Thank you, Chris, for joining me. And right off the bat, when I first started iterating this idea of mine to actually dip my foot into this large pool of podcasting, you were the guy I went to. You were the guy I talked to. I sounded off to, built ideas, conceived of a method of us doing it together, went ahead and did it on my own. And this is a thing I always thought we'd have fun doing together. So I am extremely appreciative, A, that you were not offended or hurt, and B, that you, even beyond that, that you'd be willing and excited to come and join me and be a guest and talk about your career and stuff.
Well, I think first of all, Glenn, I think the feeling I had when I started, especially seeing you embark on this thing in a real way, like when I started to see, graphics show up on my Instagram feed, it was a sense of relief, to be honest. Like, I just don't know if I would have had any bandwidth, speaking of bandwidth, to handle it. Anyway, congrats on getting this thing off the ground, Glenn.
Well, I appreciate that a whole bunch and appreciate you a lot. So I want to lay the same thing I do with most people I talk to. I love just laying the groundwork of your career. And I've known you for long enough to have gotten a great set of diverse stories, which I've always loved and enjoyed. And I just think that you have such an incredible wide view on what this entire life looks like. So there was a part of me, though, Bud, that thought about us having a conversation in reverse instead of chronologically like I do with a lot of people. So I'm going to start there. But first, I'm going to give the flyover, because I have to make an assumption everybody doesn't know what I know. So Chris Wynters' career since the 90s had three facets of main character energy, which was your band, which was kind of the beginning stuff of Captain Tractor. And then you had a long leg where you sort of moved into actually working in the industry as the executive director of Alberta Music, the Provincial Music Association. And then you've embarked on a career, with a company that is carving, a pretty significant part of work, at least work into the Canadian music and international landscape, really, with Six Shooter Records in a couple of capacities. So those, when I look, even someone knowing you as well, feel like these sort of main pivot parts of a career. But in between that, you've got like all kinds of cool accomplishments in the theater world, which was part of your first loves, and actor, writer, director. I think you've probably done all the things. You've probably done the lights, and you've done the sound engineering on some things, and you've scored.
Never lights, Glenn, never lights. But
oh, good. Okay. Definitely the scoring as well, the music part of it, I know. And then you opened a studio, you built a studio in your backyard, and were a big part of production and recording for a lot of Alberta music artists, especially for a significant period of time, which is also, a career to itself for a lot of people. So, and I've probably missed a handful of related industry things.
You got it pretty well. It's pretty close.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think about it all as just like, how did I pay the bills, right? Like, I actually went, it all started as like, I went to, decided I wanted to go to, I had rock bands when I was in high school and stuff. So I was into that. And then I was going to go to the music program at MacEwan in Edmonton. And I accidentally did a couple plays in Grand Prairie, Alberta, where I was growing up. And one of the directors from the theater program at MacEwan said, you should go into theater. So I went, sure. Okay. It was just kind of like, I think that's always been what I've been about, is just kind of like looking for opportunities and seeing, seeing what's possible. And then, I don't know, figuring out it's always sort of figuring out how can I live in this space. And so I did go to theater school. I did come out of theater school. I did work as an actor and, got my equity card and had a film agent in Calgary and did films and theater. And then I started this band. Well, I had a band called The Brave and Foolish before Captain Tractor that I started with Scott Peters from who's been my partner in music for 35 years. He and I started this rock band, and then that merged into Captain Tractor kind of accidentally. We were sick of taking ourselves seriously as a rock band, so we started a silly band for free beer. And of course, as soon as you're being authentic and having fun, that's when an audience develops. And all of a sudden we were called Captain Tractor, and we had a record, and we'd sold 5,000 units of this record. And it was all of a sudden went, oh my God, I guess I'm gonna follow this path for a while. And then Captain Tractor did 6 years of really serious touring, like 150 to 200 shows a year for 6 years all over the world. We sold, I don't even know, tens of thousands of records, including East of Edson, which was a gold record in the 90s. And we built homes and had families and bought cars and stuff, all from selling records and playing shows. So like, we weren't super famous or anything, but we were almost famous enough, Glenn. That's what we were.
Oh, I love it. So perfect.
Yeah. No, we were. Okay. We were able to do it. We were able to travel around and fly all over the place, and have a good time.
Okay, so I'm going to do this differently, just because you and I just always have organic conversation, and I don't feel some need that I have to hold a timeline or some version to tell a good story with you. So we started chronologically anyhow. So this is perfect, but because you've already said two things that I want to dig into with you, Chris. So I'm going to make sure I try to remember them. The first one I love is, you said, there was somebody at the school who was like, you should try theater. And so you did. And like you said, you've always been a person who's looking for opportunity. So this is an interesting factor of how people, I think, not just in our industry in music, but in a lot of places in general industries, a lot of us, when we're discovering either our likes, also our passions, even to that level, or just the things we're good at, because everyone tosses the passion word around these days. Do what you're passionate about. Most of us just are trying to figure out what we're good at, especially when we're in our younger years. And if somebody sees it and recognizes it, don't you think it often feels like a huge open door, and that's why you walk through it, and that's how you get there? Is that sort of how that felt for you? And I guess what I'm wondering is, did it feel like you were going after those roles, or did the things you were doing just land you in a place where someone either made a suggestion or opened a door? If you know where I'm kind of getting at with that.
I do. I think, yeah. when an opportunity is presented like that, yeah, when you're young and you're trying to figure it out, it's you're not sure when you're in your 20s, in your early 20s, and you're out of high school and you're trying to go, what am I going to do now? Yeah, if somebody comes along and says you should try doing this, that's a really good indication of what direction you should go in. And I always jumped in like 100% into everything. I was really set. I was going to go to do my master's degree in acting at York University in Toronto, and then Captain Tractor took off. And I called up the school to say, hey, could I get a year, check in with you guys next year if I want to do this master's program next year? And they're like, sure. And then I don't think I ever called them back. And every time one of those doors has opened up, it's always been, I always think about that. The studio was the thing like that. I've been recording music since I was 16. I had a 1/4-inch 8-track reel-to-reel deck that I bought with like every penny I had when I was a young guy. And I recorded lots and lots of terrible songs for 5 years on that, but it was really lovely. And I still have that tape deck. But like when, we got into recording, we made so many records with Captain Tractor. And in that process of making those records, I learned about engineering sound, and, coupled with the experience I had recording my own songs, and opened this recording studio with James Murdoch. And then we did that for a while, and that was really fun. We produced 30 or 40 records over 5 years in that space, and some that I'm really, really proud of, that I still go back and listen to, that I think are great records. And, some that, paid the bills for sure. We'll never disclose which or which, but
that's what makes it good for you.
And then the Alberta music job came up, and that was kind of like, with James and my partnership in the studio, I tended towards executive producing things and sort of putting the bands together, and then trying to figure out what each artist was going to do after, and maybe try and make connections for them with labels or with agents or whatever. And it was kind of a thing, I remember the job posting came up, and Murdoch came into the studio and said, hey, you'd be really good at this job. And I was like, oh, way, give me a break. No. And then over the course of a couple of days, I was like, whoa, hey, wait a minute. This is kind of an interesting departure. At the time, I was working in my backyard in a studio and getting paid and writing shows and still acting and doing, I'd never been in a boardroom really, except if it was used for like an audition for a film or something like that. And then the idea of going in and having an office and working and having staff and doing all this kind of stuff just seemed like this sort of going to the moon or something like that. So I was like, yes. And I also thought, hey, if I can connect, people from the studio to the outside world of the greater music business, maybe this is a thing I could do. And also, my own band, Captain Tractor, had some success. So I could take some of the knowledge I had from that and kind of maybe get that out to the membership of Alberta Music. And lo and behold, that, harder than getting elected, prime minister to get that job pretty much at the time. So it's very
well. I mean, we've talked obviously personally, and I just think it's interesting the way you just sort of set that whole piece up, by the way, which was I was doing this. And so when it came around, I was interested. And what you connected was I was doing a thing where I knew a bunch of people and I had some experience, and I really enjoyed connecting all of those pieces and those people together, which it feels like the way you just described it was a bit of an undersell, if I can be honest, Chris. Like at the time, I remember my exact words in a boardroom with an actual board who was working on who to hire when it comes down to the final people was I wanted a person in that leadership role who was great in the room. That's literally the term I used over and over. I said, Chris Wynters is great in the room. And I was less concerned about somebody who knew how to cross their T's and dot their I's on grant applications and run some local programming really well. We could find other people to do that. But I was really interested in growth through like vision and leadership. And I thought you had all those qualities, and you sort of slightly alluded to them in talking about
well,
yourself.
I do
there.
appreciate
but I want to amplify them, because those were really significant qualities that you had, which I think landed you that job. Yeah. So obviously you picked those up through some of these things.
Yeah, and it was kind of like thinking about what, like, if you think about that, where I was at the time, it was like 40 years old and kind of like, okay, what am I going to do now? And it presented itself in the idea, like you're saying, like okay, I live in Alberta. I've lived and worked out of Edmonton, Alberta, my whole life. I love the city. I love the province. The idea of like I always enjoyed Calgary, and my band Captain Tractor always did really well in Calgary, and so I spent some time in Calgary doing theater too, and always enjoyed my time down there. And I just thought, wow, it would be really fun to like travel around and try and promote this province and its music industry. And the idea of the international possibilities of connecting artists to an international audience was something that I found really exciting too. And it's really amazing how, many of those connections I made, even probably in the first year at Alberta Music, are still the people that I'm connected with now, still every day.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like there's not really an education for most of this. Like you don't go to school, but a lot of our roles that evolve in the music business come from having a great sense of building relationships and making good connections with people, and then having the foresight to be active and get shit done. Let's just say, there's a lot of people who just talk and sit on bar stools, and then there's people who get shit done. What part of that is true for you? What part of that has sort of run true throughout your career?
Yeah, I say relationships are everything in anything you're in. I think it's all about relationships. I think of my job, or I've always thought of my job in whatever role that was at the time, as being connecting with people. I've always thought about it as being building up this, international gang of friends, I think so like I never think about going into a room and it's networking. It's like, oh my God, I'm at this thing and all my friends are here. Like, and no, I want to meet some new friends. Like it's really honestly, like there's nothing that happens in anything that you can't make anything happen. You can only be a conduit for something that's going to happen. You can't like force an artist onto an agent that isn't going to like the artist. It's never going to work.
Yeah.
All you can do is kind of present the artist to the agent, and if they're like, hey, I think this would be a good fit for you, and if they're into it, they're into it, and then that's a relationship and that works. But my point is that I think the more of that sort of knowledge and the more people that you get to know over your life, sometimes I met an agent like 15 years ago, and all of a sudden I see this artist that's like, oh, I think that agent that I knew 15 years ago would love this artist. And so it's just like that kind of stuff. It builds up over the years. And I think that's why this sort of, as you get older and more experienced, part of it is that you're older and more experienced. And part of it is that just you've had access to more and more people over the years and more relationships over the years.
Yeah, I do think though the maturity, the sort of the growth from experience though is captured in the way you're able to express that, which is basically asserting that the work you do right now might have fruit 15 years later. The work you're doing, especially when it's relational work, does seem to be like you're playing the long game, like you're investing in the future so often, not just now. I also caught a really great hint and point about authenticity when you say, I'm not at a networking event to network. I'm here to like see some old friends and make some new ones, which, could be just a funny way to spin it, unless it comes across as authentically as the way you just said it, which is that's really what it is and what it's really about.
I mean, you could sound pretentious. Like, I mean, it does sound kind of like, oh yeah, right, Chris, like that's right. But I mean, but the truth is that if I'm at a thing and I don't feel like going to this networking thing or whatever it is, it won't be successful. It won't be good. You can only be authentic. I think if you're not authentic, it's obvious, and things don't happen, and it's I don't know. I mean, I think maybe when I was young, I would go into these things. I remember going to like Canadian Music Week when I was in a rock band when I was in my mid-20s, and I'd be like, oh, I gotta do this and I gotta do this, and it just doesn't ever work. And part of that's because you're young and nobody cares, and part of that's because you're obviously just trying to work the room or whatever that is, right? I don't know.
And you don't know how. Absolutely, you don't know how, but you are filled with some zealousness to try to make it happen, right? Like you've been in so many of these rooms, and it would be great to hear you talk about through your career what some of those important rooms that you might end up in are and what you've learned. Is that too big?
I do want to say that when I started out, I remember one of my first trips that I went on for Alberta Music was to Folk Alliance, and it was in Toronto. It was like 1 year when it was in Toronto. Usually it's in the States. It was in Montreal this year, but so I went to Montreal, and I remember like sort of looking at some of the things, and I was like, oh man, like there's a folk DJs thing going on, and I was thinking about folk DJs, like, wow, that sounds kind of cool. thinking that it meant that they were going to be spinning some vinyl in the lobby, and it was
And some
be like
and remixing over top of
like,
it. Okay.
and some scratching and stuff. And then I went to this thing thinking it was going to be this groundbreaking progressive like thing that I'd never heard of. Folk geez, that's so cool. And then I realized, oh, I just walk in and it's a bunch of like, 70-year-old dudes with beards, and it's like, oh, they're the DJs from like all these NPR stations. Now I get it. So like, I just wanted to point out, like, it's like you kind of learn as you go, and sometimes it's like it's trial and error, and it's fun. But I guess my point with that is that it's like I still feel like I'm learning like that. Like when I go into a new space or there's a bunch of people that I don't know, like it really is like it takes time to kind of sort out what are the politics of this space, and who's, what's everybody want, what's everybody's agenda, that kind of stuff. But I guess, it's been team building. I said, earlier in this chat that I'm still connected to some of the people I first met, 15 years ago, and the first days at Alberta Music, not quite 15 years ago, but and that's true, and everything's sort of, it's all about team building. I'm talking about like the Dead South now. There's another artist, so, like I met them for the first time in my Alberta Music days, like they were a band where, when Alberta Music was doing an event at South by Southwest, say, or the Great Escape in Brighton, England, or at Reeperbahn or wherever, we would often partner with the other music industry associations in Breakout West, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, sometimes the territories. And very often, at least for the first couple of years, we would partner with Saskatchewan, with Sask Music. And we had this brand at events like South by Southwest called How the West Was Won, that our friend Derek Bachman kind of started up. And so I remember meeting the Dead South guys the first time at one of these things, and they were just on a bill. So there were, 3 bands from Alberta and 3 bands from Saskatchewan, and they were one of the bands. And I thought, those guys are cool. And, you get to know them and you see them at different things around the world. And then they become sort of like, one of your like conference buddies you might have a beer with at a thing. So when it turned out that they were looking for a new mentor, it was like, hey, I already knew these guys. And we at Six Shooter thought it would, they were a really good fit, and they were already kind of interested in Six Shooter as a label and all that. So, but my point is that it's like, even that relationship has come about because it's all a long game, Glenn, all of it. Like it's really hard. Like looking for other management clients, like I'm constantly looking, and it's incredible how, you can go into a basement, pub venue in Northeast London in Shoreditch, see some artist playing on a stage in front of 50 people, and go up to them after and go, hey, you were great. That's great. What's your situation? They go, oh, just check my Insta. And then, you look at their Insta and like, oh my God, they're signed to a label in New York and their management is this huge management. It's like, it's really, really a lot, the teams are coming together really early these days, like things are happening really, the development of artists starts happening really early. The rooms are forever changing, but they're always kind of similar people in them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great thread to tie. I was going to ask, do you think that perception, just from that anecdote of this band it has a whole machine behind it, but it gave you the appearance of an up and comer, right? That this is at the stage of their career where they might be looking to build a team. They're obviously really good, and they're, have a great response from the people in the room. So it's worth that conversation. And then it generated a surprise. Do you think the surprise has anything to do that you and I are of the same age range and demographic, that we might have established these sort of just versions of bias that are hard to, maybe they just come out, where we just make assumptions based on the way we knew it always used to be?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like you just assume that because somebody's playing in a basement in Shoreditch that they don't have a team yet. Like that.
Yeah, because I've had the same experience, Chris. I've gone to a show or a club and saw the opener, and I assume they're unknown, and they're not unknown. Or even a more classic one right now that happens to me literally every week is like my daughter, whom we share music together all the time now. And she gets excited when she thinks she's in on the ground floor with somebody. So the other day she said, I discovered this new artist who like looks like they're just kind of up and coming and they're really cool. And then I went and looked at their Spotify and they had 4 songs with over 1 million streams. And I just said to her, I'm like, in the world I live in with quote unquote unknown up and coming artists, hardly any of them have over one song with 1 million streams yet. And it's not like 1 million streams is buying them a house, obviously, but I'm just saying it's in that scale. And maybe I'm looking at that wrong again because of old information or old bias, but the world's changed that way. And I catch myself in it quite often.
Yeah. Well, I think, you never know. Right. Like, and there's also artists who still come across sometimes that have gone quite far and have a following and are doing quite well that don't have any team. So, I mean, it really is like, it does in Canada. I find it a little bit more like you might find artists that don't have teams yet that are doing quite well. Maybe not with streaming, but with like building a live business and that. In terms of like, with the Dead South, they did already have a team when we came on board. We just were more, we just kind of came in as somebody that could help them get from where they were at, which is, 4 guys and a sound guy in a van driving around to, where they're now, which is, 4 guys and 8 crew in a bus and a semi truck going everywhere. And, that took about 1.5 years to go from it happened really fast. There was already a trajectory, but I don't think, they definitely needed more of a team to kind of get to the next level. And I think we came in kind of fulfilled that for them. But, in terms of them, their first team member was an agent in Canada. And I think that's something I'm seeing more and more these days is that very often the first team member that's not inside the band, often like, somebody in the band is going to act as manager. Yeah. Maybe several of the artists in the band are going to be managers of different skills. That's certainly how things were with Captain Tractor when we started. And then, that's the agent, because the live business is kind of the first thing that makes sense to build. It's playing in front of people is kind of that's the first most important aspect to music, I think, and then recording it and getting the recorded music out is the next thing. But I kind of personally work. I mean, I know it doesn't have to work like that, but personally, I understand the business more if an artist has a live business, that works in tandem with the recording, selling recordings and so that's sort of where I gravitate. And I know with the Dead South, when the opportunity came out to manage them, it was like, I totally get this band, like they're roots, don't like that word, but they're kind of, they're an acoustic, fun live band. Yeah. And Captain Tractor had been like that. And literally exactly. Like the first shows when we started working with them in December of 2017, and they had a tour coming together at that point, a US tour in March of 2018. So the first real tour that we worked on them with was a US tour down the West Coast of the US. And all the venues were like a lot of the same venues that Captain Tractor had played, 200-300 cap venues. And it's like, I know all these venues. It's going to be great. Well, the shows went on sale and they all sold out in like 20 minutes. And I was like, okay, this is not like Captain Tractor. And at that point it diverged. We upgraded all the venues, and in most cases they didn't end up playing any of the venues that Captain Tractor had been playing. So it was like it instantly was kind of like the whole thing was already moving in a direction, and we just had to sort of throw fuel onto the fire and make it go faster and build more.
Yeah, I mean, we've alluded to a few interesting things. I just think about the difference between the way things used to be done and the way things are now in the industry. And you've had, I think, the privilege in the span of time that you've been doing this from band to business like this to see a lot of those changes, right? I mean, so your bands, ironically, that you're full-time, mostly full-time here, I'm pretty sure they take up all your time, managing the Dead South, who people should definitely go and check out if they haven't, and they're an incredible live show. So, I have trouble pigeonholing genre, which is fine. I mean, they don't want to be pigeonholed genre-wise anyhow by me, but there's familiarity to people from various adjacent things, right? So there's the stompy four guys can just sit with their acoustic instruments together up front, and mainstream influenced music fans would feel like Mumford and Sons adjacent, versus people who are more in the folk background probably have a good handful of people that they could connect the stylings to. When I went to see the show that you invited me to, it definitely felt like more in the outlaw country, folky country, kind of like in the pure folk sort of history,
like Dead
right?
South are very like bluegrass, like it
Yeah,
really
that's
is. When you cut
exactly
it down,
yeah,
it's
to me, is that.
legitimate bluegrass, like they don't, they take the craft of songwriting, and they take that, and they're big fans of bluegrass that come from that whole world. Not to totally speak for them, I don't. I just, in terms of their artistry and stuff like that. But they're four guys from Regina, Saskatchewan that they decided to. Their first time they played was at an open mic, and it was just for
Yeah,
fun. And their big aspiration was to play a gig at the Exchange someday, in Regina, like the venue. And
yeah,
and I kind of understand that, like, because the same, our aspirations with Captain Tractor were literally to like get free beer at Mickey Finn's on Sunday nights, like so I kind of get going back to authenticity again. Like sometimes it's just like you just have something that just it is authentic. Like it works in an open mic situation, and people go, hey, this is really fun, I really like this. And not that I was at any of those shows, but I have seen a lot of footage of some of those early shows of them doing it in the playing in people's basements and stuff like that. It looks, they're playing some of the same songs they're playing now live, and in front of
yeah.
you know 6,000 people in Prague, just headlining shows, 6,000 people in Prague, not
Oh,
a festival show. This is it's really wild to see, that authenticity translate to an international audience. And I don't know what it is. It's about, it's about branding. It's about commitment. It's about artistry. It's all these things. And these guys are just so, they're very hard workers. That's definitely where Captain Tractor started, like, let's make a band, and there's 6 of us in the band, and there's a sound person, and, we'll play a show, and you get $1,000 for this show and $2,000 for that show, and then $50 in a case of beer for that show. But everything goes in a pot. And how much money do you need to live? All right, I need $500 a month to live. And so everybody pays. It's kind of like we had this collective, and it's just the ethic of it. It's not like, that's not how things are working now, but I think that there's still the idea that that's closer to what a big company is like than, oh, I play a show for $2,000 and everybody puts $400 in their pocket, and that's and that's it.
yeah.
The idea that you're kind of growing something and building something, it's definitely the, how do you get from point A to point B, that you have to sort of be growing the nest egg. And I guess I'm not sure how I got onto this from what we were talking about, but
You're talking about Captain Tractor. This was the 90s, right? This is the mid to later 90s, or the later 90s maybe. But
started in early 90s, but like, yeah.
okay, yeah,
First
early, yeah.
came out in
So
94. Yeah.
a very sort of different culture economy of all of these pieces and time. But that whole version of a band that goes on a road and sort of develops their chops and gains an audience alongside of what, like, Gen Xers who were sort of running wild at that time had, one of their truest and deepest principles was authenticity. So it's not surprising that you're talking about that, right? Because rock and roll was all about like being extremely real and not being a sellout in a number of the subgenres. It was very high importance, but especially that I'm going to go on the road, right? I'm going to build an audience the real way, and only the real ones will survive that way. I'm just wondering if, like, you literally lived it. And I think it's fun because if people don't know and they need to check it out, like Chris and Captain Tractor, you're currently bringing some of those old days back to life, and did some re-recording of original recordings, and are going to be playing some shows. So that obviously probably feels a little fresh for you right now, pulling back on some of the memories. So I'm curious, what can you tell people what it was like in the 90s, for more than just 6 of us jumped in a van and thought, hey, someone's going to pay us, a case of beer and $50, or the next guy's going to pay us $1,000. It's the same thing. Let's go do it. What if you can, like, maybe just
Sure. I'm a bit facetious in saying that we started it for free beer. That's the truth, but it really was kind of like, it really was fun, and it was really important to us to have fun. And first of all, and not sound like a 56-year-old old Gen Xer. I'm one of the oldest in the Gen X. I think I got 3 years within the Gen X generation. But grew up in punk rock. Grew up on the west coast of Canada in the punk rock scene in Victoria with bands like No Means No and DOA, and bands from over in Seattle like the Minutemen, or not Minutemen, they're Minneapolis, but the U-Men and the Young Fresh Fellows, all these bands, and there was a lot of DIY going on then, and a lot of lots of cool things happening. People. I remember coming to a show in Edmonton in 1986 to see 10,000 Maniacs, and June or Gone Wild was opening for 10,000 Maniacs, and they were an Edmonton band, and and they had a record like on vinyl for sale, and the idea that you could be I guess I was in this thing. I never really, punk rock was not the kind of music I played, and so seeing a band like June or Gone Wild play a show, and they weren't punk rock, and it was they were independent, and that sort of blew my mind. And it was years later that but anyway, the one thing I would say is that I think that sort of 1991 to 2000, maybe 1999 2000, was literally the golden age of independent bands releasing their own music. Like, it really was the time when you had this sort of Venn diagram of all these sort of important things. If there's the media, the value of music, like I'm trying to think of all these things, they all sort of find this spot in the middle of the Venn diagram. We had, maybe we didn't have the internet like it is today, but Captain Tractor was the first band to have a website. So you think about the advantages you have over, not everybody's on the internet, so people don't know that, but the people that are into it. So we were able to sort of use the burgeoning internet through all these university kids across Canada in this like network of people, of fans that would like do stuff like petition Much Music to play our videos and things like that. Like, nobody had heard of us, and we had this sort of underground following. So and people would buy a CD for $15 from you, and you could record it for you could make a record for 10 grand or 20 grand, but you could just turn that money around. And we put our first record out, Land, in 1994. We pressed 1,000 copies of it. We sold 1,000 copies in like 9 days. So we pressed 2,000 copies, and we sold those 2,000 copies in like 20 days. And then all of a sudden we were at Christmas of 1994, and we'd sold 4,000 copies of this record, and we had 50 grand in the bank. We could have all bought anyway, we could have bought a house, but we didn't. Anyway, I just sort of putting that into today's perspective. It's just not the math isn't the same,
It's not possible. Yeah.
It's not possible. So by the time, we're putting out in 1995, we put out a record called East of Edson, which, we'd learned a lot from the first record. It was, the first record has got a lot of flaws, to put it mildly. But there's some great moments on it, but we were ready. We were so excited to get in the studio to make this second record. And we had a year of really heavy touring and a whole bunch of songs that were really road tested. And you put this record out. I remember Up the Hill was the first single from East of Edson, and I wrote that song just before Land, the first album, came out. And we first played Up the Hill, which was the first single from the second album, at the album release party for Land. And we knew instantly that it was like the kind of hit song that we wished was on the first record. So we were really excited to make the second record. So anyway, so East of Edson came out, and we had in that time built up all this infrastructure. For instance, we had this wonderful woman, Melanie Cheek, came out of the Arts and Cultural Management program at MacEwan and was working as doing her practicum with Captain Tractor in our office. We had a little office on 109th Street. And what seemed like a good thing for her to do was, we need to distribute these records. So she she was like figuring out, okay, going around the HMVs, and then she's calling, you know, the HMV in Saskatoon and the HMV in Calgary and saying, hey, can you take, you know, 20 of these, 20 copies of these and 20, and then they would, you know, they were selling and she was replacing them, and her practicum ended, you know, after 8 or 10 weeks or whatever that was. And she's like, hey, you know, I could keep doing this for you guys. Like, what if I just charge like, you know, $2 a unit to you guys to put these into the stores? And we said, sure. And she did that for a while. And then she's like, oh, you know, a few other artists want me to do this as well. Do you mind if I make this a business? And she started Spirit River Distribution out of our office, and that became a factor recognized national distributor of music in retail. And so those kinds of things happened. We sold tens of thousands of copies of East of Edson. It was just a massive, you know, and then Bought the Farm, which was our third record that came out in 1997. We ordered 20,000 units to start. You know, like we had 20,000 units on a flat that showed up in front of our office. Like it's a, you know, this is, and we sold, you know, we sold all these records, and we were making $10-12 a unit on them. So that's a significant amount of money for a bunch of 20 somethings to be making, you know.
Yeah. And I mean, to put that in perspective about that showing up in your front doorstep, if I think back to what a box of 1,000 would have looked, actually they came in 500s. So 1,000 together would be like someone getting, for as many people can understand the current reference, it would be like getting, well, if that's 1,000, you said 20,000. So it's like getting 20 Hello Freshes delivered on a pallet to your front door. Hello Fresh boxes of food would be sort of a similar size reference, which is really quite amazing. I remember being excited just the first time I ordered 1,000 CDs and getting those boxes and cutting them open, and then crapping your pants about how to sell them. But two things like that I think are funny. One is I just have to reference what you're talking about being the first on the internet. I built my first website, which is like what gave me my career for most of my life. But I built my first website in 1995 when it seemed nobody knew how to build a website yet. And I figured that stuff out. And similar to what you were saying, I'll never forget one of the first things I did was create a hypothetical band that I always wished I had at the moment, but I didn't have anybody to play with. And I called it Sons of Ed because that's what I had always wanted to call my band. And I made this whole thing up, and I was getting messages from all around North America because you're right, so few people were on it, and the people that were so invested in being the first to market, so to speak, of discovering everything that was out there. So that's kind of funny. It made me think of when you were telling your little bit how I was like, I have.
Did people think it was a real band?
100%. Like I'm not joking when I say I might feel like I made as much buzz with that fake band as I've maybe made a buzz with anything else I've tried. I don't think it felt like that at the time. But yeah, I think that's really cool and interesting. I also think just the aspect you're talking about of we did this and then we did this and then we did this and we just kept cutting it and growing it. In the 90s, like you said, it was a golden age. Absolutely. But you were definitely responding to the response that you were getting. And I think I love that idea of authenticity too, which how everything seems to ever become something in the music business is because there's an authentic response between someone who's creating something and the people who want more of what they're creating. And we hear all kinds of nasty bits that are about all the things in between that, whether it be like the people and the layers that are created and the people in the business who try to take advantage of that maybe. And we've got all kinds of great stereotypes over the last decades and decades and decades of everything that happens around and in between that authentic interchange. Don't you think, between, you know, I want to just really make the thing that represents me and that I want to make, and I find an audience for it, right?
The thing that I find right now that's it's like everything's a platform now. Everything's a tech, you know, it's a tech, and the tech always gets paid first, you know? Like, what platform are we recording on here? You know, like we're recording this podcast on a platform, and they're getting their money, you know? Anyway, I just not to sort of, there are things that sort of going back to thinking about the difference between then and now. Like, there are things that I think about, like, sure, we were really successful in that model and we sold lots of CDs, physical CDs to people. And at the time, he thought about growth as being like, let's conquer this city, and then we'll conquer that city, and then we'll conquer this
Yeah.
city. And we'll try and find, like, 200 people in each city to like our band and buy CDs. And that was kind of the way. And I often think, if we'd have had the tools that are there now, like I think with Captain Tractor, we would have been really into TikTok, and we would have been really, really into video messaging people. We were into social media before there was social media. Like we had a newsletter that we sent out to thousands of people 4 times a year that was called the Captain's Log, and it was funny, and it was like little, like it was like a little, it was set up like a little kind of zine kind of thing that we sent
Yeah.
out. And it cost us, like, like if you think about, I think we had at the height of it maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people on our mailing list, like physical mailing list. So if we we mailed out to all of that at 40 cents for stamp, and whatever it cost us to do the print, like it cost us a couple $1,000s every time we did a mail out. But it had a
Yeah.
little cutout coupon thing on the back, so you could order some merch, order a t-shirt, and so we would make $5,000 or $6,000 every time we put one of those things out. But I just think about, like, that's not very efficient. And one of the things that I see now is that the fact that we're still able to, 6 Shooters putting out our 30-year-old record, East of Edson, our gold record, for the first time on vinyl. It's coming out in April. Part of the reason why we're still able to play and people pay us money to do shows, and we still perform 5 or 10 times a year, more some years, is because of Spotify and Apple Music. And there's something about those digital versions of those albums living on those platforms that anybody in the world can access. So if somebody goes, oh, what is this band? And they just look, they can go and like find and listen to every single thing you've ever recorded.
Mhm.
Like, that's kind of cool in a lot of ways. Like I wish that these platforms paid artists more fairly. And I think that's something that the industry is working towards. And I think we will get there eventually. Hopefully. Maybe I'm a little Pollyanna on that, but like I do feel that I am an optimist, so I'm gonna err on that side all the time. But
Good for you.
I do
That's good.
think that it's really, these platforms are also super useful. And I was just at like a mother show at Rogers Place in Edmonton last Saturday.
Mm.
And I mean, there's a band, they've been around 20 years, and all of a sudden things take off for them on TikTok. They've never played an arena. So they never had a sold out arena
I
show
was
in
so
Edmonton
surprised,
before.
but you're
So
right.
it's massive, right? It's massive. So
Yep.
there's a lot of opportunity to come from these platforms,
And I guess that's the other angle of the conversation. I'm interested in your take and your perspective. Again, having seen a number of the ways that people had to figure out, as well, let's be honest, as technology is a primary driver of change over those 30 years that you've been doing a lot of this stuff. So as we've watched change happen with technology, platforms, or how we connect that person who's creating with an audience that wants what they're creating. Obviously, the most recent ones is like, well, for you, breaking out meant like you had to get into a bus. You had to do the legwork. You had to create a newsletter. You had to, first of all, go up and meet those people, the majority of them probably by shaking hands at a show or something in a city, to obtain and get their mailing address, which there's complete multi-million-dollar machines built around just trying to like lead gen in today's day and age and get people to give you their email address or something so you can send them things.
Yeah,
Different
now
world,
you're putting a
different
QR
time.
code with set.live
Yeah.
at your show, and people are gonna
Yeah.
win a free.
Whereas you did that work manually and built a thing. So same, but different, and created the connection and created that opportunity for yourself, and to break out and to sort of like get known. Like, you had a different version of like, when do you kind of get over that first hump and then that second hump? Like, you were referencing it like, we sold this many CDs, and then we had to keep reordering so that when you made the next record, you just started from 20. Like, that's getting over a hump. And there's been different versions along the way of what it looks like for when a band is actually in a career or in that gray area of a career. And I'm wondering, I would love your insight on that. I find it interesting. I'm wondering if other people would find it interesting. Like you said, like maybe we could have bought a house with 50,000 in the 90s because we made that much money off of being able to sell physical product back then, which we can't now. And I remember a band called Lowest of the Low that I really loved, mid 90s. And their first record was, for a long time in Canada, the highest grossing independent record, quote unquote. They sold so many units of it. That stood for quite a while. And but I don't know if they had I assumed they had a career. Like from my eyes at the time, I just assumed this is their life, their career. Maybe they weren't, right? So I'm wondering your insight and your perspective over a couple of these phases, if I can think like the late 90s versus the 2000s versus closer to now, how you've seen that grow and change.
Well, first of all, side note, I think Lowest to Low is the band I've seen more often than any other band. And every time I've seen them, with the exception of once, was in Toronto. So just saying, I think I've seen them like over 30 times, 29 times in Toronto, probably 15 of those times at Sneaky D's. So there you go.
Well,
anyway,
call back. I saw them at the Exchange in Regina multiple times, which you already referenced.
All right. Well, they would have come through there a lot. I'd say the Lowest of the Low, yeah, definitely. Like they sold a lot of records. I mean, think about the Bare Naked Ladies. They sold a lot of records. Like that was what was going on back then. And then, Lorena McKenna, like she was selling records on her own. She decided to shoot her, record deal and sell records on her own. And she did, all these people did really well because they didn't. I think Lowest of the Low didn't actually sign a record deal after that. Anyway, the 90s to the 2000s I often say, like, okay, so the math, if you do the basic math, this is to be the bummer side of it first. The basic math, let's just make it really super simple. You make a record for $10,000, you press 1,000 CDs, you sell them for $10 each to your friends, you make your $10,000 back, right? Like that's just the basic math. So then the Apple Music, Napster comes in, the MP3 is invented at the end in the 90s. All of a sudden people are stealing music off the internet. People are burning CDs for their friends at shows. I remember people coming up out to me saying, yeah, man, I burned like 80 copies for my friends of your record. I love it so much. And be like, oh my God. Anyway.
Did you get asked to sign one? Did you ever get asked to sign a burned CD?
Yes. And I did sign many of them. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But so then by the 2000s, you're like, okay, so say you can still make a record for $10,000. Well, the Apple Music model of like $9.99 sale, the sale of $9.99 for an album on iTunes,
download of an MP3,
a downloadable one. So you're going to get $5 from that. So all of a sudden you got to sell 2,000 downloads to make your $10,000 back, right? So you're gone as an independent band from Edmonton. You've gone from having to sell 1,000 copies to 2,000. Well, if you take that into the 2010s and the Spotify, Apple Music streaming, at 0.0007 cents, like you're at, you got to stream your album to make your $10,000. It's into millions of streams, and that's just not going to happen for an independent band. So that's the bummer side of it.
Good luck making it for $10,000 in the 2020s.
For sure. Although people can make pretty good records at home. I mean, the technology, arguably, in order to make a really good record in the 90s, you needed to spend like $40,000 or $50,000, really. And we did do that. Like we did spend a lot more money on records later in the 90s than we did in the early days. But the good side of now, I think, and what's starting to happen, or what I see bands that are successful, it's sort of about, it used to be about conquering each city at a time and finding 200 people in a city to be your fan, and maybe 2,000 people eventually in each city to be your fan. Now it's about like finding those internet, like it's about finding 20,000 people in the world to be your fan. Like it's the reach is so much farther, and it's not specific to location. It's more about finding people that are just into what you're doing and finding that audience through the platforms. Now, that doesn't really translate into a live business. It's pretty hard to, if all of a sudden you have a song blow up in, Bucharest, it's not going to be very easy for you and your band to get in a van and drive there and play some shows. But people are doing that, and I'm seeing that. And the other thing is just that, like I was talking about social media, like a lot of artists who are really good at communicating through these. I was, it's interesting to listen to Dan Mangan on your first episode of this, but it's like, you know, your job as an artist now is, you know, partly music creation, partly performance, and
Content
mostly
creator.
content creation and marketing. And you know, because marketing has to be authentic. And so if you just, you know, even if you have a team at the record label doing it for you, you
Yeah,
still
they're
have
gonna
to
tell
do
you.
it.
Yeah, they're like, you got
You
to get in
can't
front of the
fake it.
camera. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't fake it. And so there are, you know, I'm not going to name any specific artists, but like there are several artists that are really, really good at this and doing really well internationally, and have massive careers without really much in the way of radio support or support from DSPs, like from Spotify or Apple Music, or support
Mhm.
from whatever's left of the traditional media. There's not a lot left of the traditional media. You know, we don't really have music writers per se everywhere in the world anymore.
Yep.
So I'm starting to see quite a few artists that really are able to, you know, make a real go of it.
Yeah.
I find that exciting, and actually, you know, be working with the Dead South, you know, they're one of these kinds of artists that, you know, they're not on the radio. Probably a lot of people listening to this podcast have never heard of them, but this band sells 2 to 5,000 cap venues, headline shows anywhere
Yeah.
in the world. Like it's like, and using the platforms like, you know, Spotify, you know, we can see, like the management team, we can tell how many tickets they're going to sell in Melbourne, Australia, compared to Amsterdam, Netherlands,
Mm.
um, by the numbers of people streaming the music over the last 28 days in each of those markets.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the tools are very useful too. You know, they have a good side and a bad side. And, you know, you can reach an international audience and you can use them to sort of figure out what's happening with your music. Like when you know, somebody in the 90s was playing your song on the radio in Bucharest, you had no idea. But now
Well,
you can see,
you had no data and you had no analytics
now you can
to
see,
interpret
whoa,
the
like we
data.
just got 5,000 Shazams in Berlin. Like what's going on there? And
Yeah.
you can dig into it and figure it
Yeah.
out, right? And so there's some really interesting things happening with that. But the problem is that, you know, the amount of money that these platforms are not profitable really. Like if they were to pay a fair
Yeah.
share to the artists, they just wouldn't make enough money.
So let me ask you this question then. You know, it's 2025. I'm not even going to like talk like I'm one of the kids. Like say I'm one of these people who has been writing songs for a really long time and I sort of understood the industry to work maybe a certain way and I thought I had to get out and play open mics or I had to do some version. Like you talked about how you had to go like city to city and sort of conquer a city, right, to build an audience further and further out and stuff. So what do you feel right now if I'm writing songs and I'm not going to lock it into a genre, but if I'm making music and writing songs, what do you feel like the first step outside of your initial circle of, because the initial circle in music, right, is always your friends and family or whoever has supported you. And it's kind of like your yes men. And every artist has to take that first step outside and see whether anybody else actually gives a shit. And that can be pretty wide and pretty large step. But I'm wondering what you feel right now. What's that first step for the person who's like, okay, I need to go and test this out?
Well, I think that really varies. It depends on where you are, you know? I mean, maybe it is, and it depends on the genre. It depends on everything. I think, you know, like using the platforms, this is not my expertise at all, but you know, you see artists using platforms like TikTok and Instagram and others, and to, you know, push short bits, you know, short content versions of songs out to people. And I really do think that that's kind of the most that you're going to get from your time spent is to sort of work the platforms and see, you know, if you can drum up a fan base. I also think that it's worth getting, you know, playing live shows and building things that way, and building in your backyard first, I think is still important.
And now you're working hands-on with bands where you're trying to give them international opportunities and make the connections so that you can sort of build teams and networks everywhere. So I guess the big question for me is like, from what you've seen then, where do you see the opportunity? And I know the part of the answer to this before I even say it is it depends. But the opportunity, it's not just to make that leap, the traditional leap as an artist, like when do I quit my job and do this? I'm actually more interested now in when does someone start to actually try to make those international connections? Is it much earlier in their career? How do they make those connections and opportunities since they're kind of playing in the most global version of a market that we've ever had?
This is a loaded question, and I work for a Toronto-based record label that has signed, almost entirely Canadian artists. I have never thought about this business or anything except on a global level. Like I live in Edmonton, Alberta, because I love Edmonton, Alberta, and it's a good place to be an artist, and it's I have a very high standard of living because it's one of the most inexpensive places to live in Canada. There's an airport. Anyway, I know when I was at Alberta Music, I love Toronto. Toronto's a great scene. I love it. But it costs almost as much money to get in a plane and fly to Toronto as it does to get in a plane and fly to London Heathrow. And so and this was always something, at Alberta Music that we always talked about was like, okay, well, let's focus on Europe. Let's focus on, and I mean, I literally am managing a band who literally has only toured Canada twice. Like this is a band that's toured Germany 25 times, and so they're a living success story of the Music Industry Association system. Their first record deal was with the German label Devil Duck, who, Jörg Tresp used to come
Jörg is great.
Yeah, used to come to Breakout West and saw them. He actually saw them at Canadian Music Week the first time. But, I remember at Alberta Music, we probably had, 10 artists that came through our system that maybe they weren't making a ton of money, but they were going over and coming back with a profit from doing, 1 or 2 or 3 tours a year in Europe. And Canada is a really difficult country to tour, and you need to, it's 12 gigs, and you need to be at a certain level to make it work. And anyway, I guess my point is you need to go after the international people right away. I think you got to grow in your backyard, but the farther away you go from home, this is my own personal feeling, and maybe not the feeling of lots of people associated with me, but my experience has been the farther away you go from home, the more interesting and exotic you become. Captain Tractor, our first big tour was to New Zealand. It's insane. We went literally halfway around the planet to tour for 9 weeks in a country that has the population of Toronto. But the fact that we did that to the people in New Zealand, we were kind of, we were exotic. We were from Canada. We were from Western Canada. Nobody has any concept outside of Canada what that means. It's like we don't think of like Germany and go, oh, I really prefer Bavaria to some other state. But like we don't really think about it like that because we just think about Germany. Maybe it's Berlin. Maybe it's Hamburg or whatever, but you don't really know the details. And so when you go away, somewhere far away, even if you're from like, Wetaskiwin, Alberta, like that becomes an exotic place to be from. And sometimes in Canada, when you're trying to go to Toronto and you're like from Edmonton, people are kind of like, oh, you're from Edmonton. But if you're in London, Edmonton seems just as cool as Toronto. So that's I throw it out there as a Canadian, as a person working in the Canadian music business.
Well, that's a really good answer.
But that's a Western perspective. Love Canada, but sometimes a way of attacking Canada is to get some good stories outside of Canada and bring them back to Canada, and then people are like, oh, this is really interesting.
Well, we could obviously talk for hours about every little facet of this thing, but I also want to respect your time. So I appreciate you taking the time to sort of reflect on the versions of questions that I'm asking and give your perspective. And I always love hearing what you have to say because you also deliver it with a good dose of humility and appreciation for everyone around you that you get to work for, which is why it feels like I'm very honored to have you on and to be able to have the conversation.
I appreciate that. I would want to say one thing
my backyard.
That I did say earlier that there were some records that we produced back in the 90s that, in the early 2000s that, I really loved and I'm really proud of, and some that I'm maybe not so proud of. And that the 2 Wheat Pool records and also the 2, like that crazy 2 singles that we did, like those are some of my favorite records that I worked on in my whole life. So I really enjoyed those times, Glenn. And thinking back to those some special times making those records. Really enjoyed
Yeah.
it.
Well, me too. And I'm always super flattered that you say that. I'm pretty sure I didn't lob up a softball to try and get you to do that. But
No, that was fun. I was just thinking, God, I hope Glenn
uh,
doesn't think that I didn't like his records, because I sure did.
no, buddy, you've been always the most supportive, and I've
Okay.
always been deeply appreciative of that. And I think they were great records too. And you helped steer that, and I'll always be deeply grateful. So thank you for your time, Chris, and your friendship, and appreciate this. And who knows, maybe I'll have you on again. Maybe I'll get to keep doing this for a while, and we can just take it down a different rabbit hole.
Right on, man. Well, thanks, mate, and congrats on the podcast. Hope it goes well.
Okay, appreciate it. Appreciate you. Thanks, Chris.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.
Hey, I'm Alexi. Stick around for post fame with me and my dad.
Good evening, Lexi.
Hello.
Hello. So I was thinking, by the way, you know what the real downside of doing like a nighttime segment with you and doing podcasting is that podcasting does not lend itself well to snacks. That's what I was
true.
thinking. Because I thought, what should I bring in here with me? What should I have for snacks? And snacks does not go well with a highly sensitive microphone or any of that kind of stuff.
Unless
so,
we turn this into an ASMR segment.
No, this stuff's weird.
I hate it.
I was doom scrolling like on TikTok for way too long, and then there was like Olivia Rodrigo talking into the two microphones. She was switching and scratching her album like a vinyl. And then,
yeah, ASMR. It's one of my least favorite parts of the internet.
my goodness, that's terrible. Okay. Well, so this that's good. We're on the same page. We'll never turn this into ASMR. We are talking tonight around Chris Wynters. Chris Wynters of Captain Tractor. Chris Wynters, currently the manager of the band The Dead South, who, are doing very, very well. And you and I were invited to go watch The Dead South last time they were here by Chris. And so that was the first time I had ever actually got to see them. And they've been around quite a while for me to never have seen them play, which is a little bit strange. And did you think afterwards, like, how has this never been a folk fest band in all of that time? Like,
I had heard their name mentioned, not even in passing. I just heard their name, and never once I never listened to them before that concert. And then I heard them and saw them live, and I was like, why have I not listened to them before? How have I not heard them?
Yeah, they're pretty adjacent to lots of stuff. But yeah, he's a guy that's always had like lots and lots of stories. Anytime I can talk about any subject in the music business at any point, he will have some version of a story that's related to a person. Like he knows somebody who knows somebody, or he actually knows the person. Or it's all pretty wild. It's pretty cool.
So I was just taking notes on the bus as I do. I was writing down, it was such a small part of the podcast, but you know me and hearing one thing and then only being able to focus on that. But it was when you guys were talking about kind of the shift to more signages and like digital tools. When you guys were talking about that, and it was like interesting listening because you guys were both reflecting on it from a perspective of having been in a band in the past when those things, like those tools, weren't accessible to you in the same way that they are now. But it was interesting because I was like listening to him talk, and as someone who like has signed people and like done production as well, like I couldn't tell almost if based on like Chris's take, it's easier or harder to make it as an independent artist today. Because you guys were talking about like the example specifically of like mailing lists and having to like push yourself, and how like before it was having to make human connection and put yourself out there and go and talk to people, and then you guys kind of joked that now it's just like QR codes and made it sound as though like it's that much easier. But it's like, I don't know, I kind of had a couple of questions. It was like, does that shift, in your opinion, make things feel more impersonal, or is it just efficiency to you? And then kind of that second thing of like, okay, well, there's more tools and there's more access, but that also means more noise. So like, what does that mean for new musicians? Like, you have to break through, like you have easier tools to be successful, but then because everyone does, like, what does that mean? Like, how much do you have to break through then?
Is it easier or is it harder? here's the great myth. The internet was this idea and the promise and what they would sell you right from the beginning. And I think what you also alluded to was Chris and I are in this unique position where we learned how to build an audience pre-internet. And in the middle of our careers was the internet, of now we're shifting our work to being online from organically and in person. So we've sort of had to learn both and experience both. So the great myth was, here, come and get online, be a part of this thing. And now you can reach everybody, right?
Yeah.
So Spotify will now make my music accessible to the entire world tomorrow. It'll make my podcast accessible tomorrow, right? If I want it to. And the whole world can listen to it. But the problem is now you have access to the whole ocean, but you're just a drop in that ocean.
Yeah.
And that's the myth. And so the bare bones question of, is it easier? I don't think it's easier. I think everyone's experiencing how hard it is, because to cut through, to get attention, to be unique, to make the algorithm work in your favor. I mean, right from episode 1, talking with Dan about content creation and so that work is hard work, and people aren't prepared for it.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the long-winded answer, but so it's same but different. I don't think it's easier. I literally don't think it's easier.
That's what I was thinking. I was thinking about the band that you mentioned to him that I had mentioned in our conversation about, like, how I had said that it was not like underground, but not well picked
Not underground.
up.
New. Just new.
New. And you were like, well, they have 1 million streams on a couple of their songs. But I also just think that, and like seeing that multiple times, kind of like proves that point of like, these small new bands have the tools now to like make singles and put them, or even small EPs, put them out on Spotify, put them out on Apple Music, and have an Instagram, sometimes even a website. And then, they get put on like a Spotify made playlist, or they get put on whatever TikTok and it blows up, and now they have a couple songs with that many streams. But then you go and look at the bands and they have like maybe a very small signage, or they're not signed. They have like couple hundred Instagram followers, maybe they hit 1,000, and like no fan base. They're still playing like small house shows. Like, it's just interesting that it's like they have the tools then to make the music and to get that crazy 1 million streams. But like, how far does that really take you? It doesn't.
Yeah, well, the math on 1 million streams is very disappointing, and I don't know if musician people have probably heard a bit of it. Maybe it doesn't sink in enough to tell them, like, 1 million streams and you make a couple $1,000 or $3,000, like, that doesn't carry you very far in your career. And you're right, there's a bunch of these bands that are kind of like how he described, running into the person in some small club with 50 people in England, and you go on their Insta and they've got like 5,000 or 10,000 followers or something, really. And so you wouldn't know, like, there's all kinds of great imbalances now, which is kind of really interesting time for us to be experiencing in music, I think, right? So you don't know anymore. Like, there's stories out there about, there was a while when everybody was signing artists based on their social media following. And then you'd go and book them as on a tour, or you'd book them as an opener on some shows, anyhow, and they couldn't draw anybody. So in the live music promoter industry, who are some of the most skeptical, jaded people in the entire business sometimes, it's because their entire livelihood depends on the word draw. And that's the one area of the business I've never wanted to do, because you risk your shirt every single time as a promoter, right? Like, you have to literally survive off volume. If I put through 10 shows in a month, and one of them just is an absolute home run, that one might have to make up for the other 9 losing money, so that I break even and can pay my assistant at the end of the month, type thing. So it's a brutal, but so their whole world is draw, and that doesn't equate across the way it used to in the more organic days. You could make better assumptions about whether somebody would actually draw or not. But remember what Chris was saying, the other strength of the platform, so this is where it is easier, is the data. So he can tell based on other analytics of how things are being streamed or who's listening or responding to ads in New Zealand if they're going to be able to sell out a show when they get there.
Interesting.
With data that we would never have had, right? There was no way to know.
It was much more of a gamble.
Yeah, 100%. But yeah.
It's interesting.
So it's also funny. So thinking this week about that conversation, and I was thinking about Chris this way, because one of my favorite conversations I ever had with Chris is we were driving in the interior of BC back to Kelowna, and we were going back to the airport. We had a bit of a drive out in the hills and talking about music, of course, and into bands. And so one of my formative eras in indie music that I loved was the late 90s, the second half of the 90s. There was this explosion of indie music, and there was a certain scene. And my favorite band of that entire scene was a band called Buffalo Tom. There's another band called Dinosaur Jr. that was sort of popular at the time too. Anyhow, but Buffalo Tom was like it for me. And he was the first guy who knew their entire discography, other than Uncle Brian, who introduced me to them. So we had a great talk. Plus we bonded around another band called Frightened Rabbit from the UK. It was a great conversation. And I just remember how like one conversation like that, and somebody that he recommends, like, oh, if you like this stuff, you should have this stuff. You should listen to these things. And then going back, you know, and he's like, you should listen to their other album if you haven't really. And then you do. And then it stays with you. It's with you forever. And so Friday night, I had all the guys over for poker and pie that I haven't had over for 7 years. And these are guys, right, that have been with me for over 20 years from the late 90s. And just that they've stuck with me through things like from where I met them to then when I started in the band, and they would come out to all of our shows. I mean, one of them was asking about when was the last time you guys did a reunion? Like they were asking me that. And then the other guy was like, I still have my t-shirt. So, and which is really cool. And then they started coming over and doing hockey pools with me. And then we started poker and pie nights. And then that fell off just before the pandemic. And then the pandemic just made a wash of 5 years. Anyhow, so they were over. And the one guy was saying to me, we were talking about music a bit, and he just mentioned Ray LaMontagne, the artist Ray LaMontagne. And I'm like, oh yeah, Ray LaMontagne's awesome. And he's like, yeah, that album Trouble, my wife and I still listen to it all the time. It's one of our favorite records. And I recommended it to him.
Aww.
And so when he was coming over, he's like, my wife's like, which one's Glenn? Because it's been 7 years since we had hung out. And he's like, he's the guy that told me to buy the Ray LaMontagne Trouble record. Like that's how he referenced me to his wife, which I thought was kind of funny. But I think it's also really great because in the same way that I was reflecting on Chris, the power of music recommendations, people speaking that into your life is pretty
it's a love language.
It's a love language.
It's
kind of become our love language a little bit. It's going to sound a little cheesy probably to everybody, but kind of the premise of all this too. I mean, even today at work, someone was making a joke while I was teasing somebody else about their musical preferences and why I wouldn't give them the Sonos player. And then they said to somebody else, like, what about you? And then I'm like, oh, she's totally on board with my musical tastes, I think, more than anybody. And then she's like, yeah, probably. But she goes, my tastes are changing because my kids are influencing it. And I was like, me too. It's totally
100%.
Me too a little bit. So
I've had a couple of my friends text because like certain Spotify playlists you can make private or not.
Yep.
And like one of my favorite texts I've received in the last few months was my friend texting and was like, hey, super random, a little like awkward, but I just like had to tell you that like this playlist you made has been like on repeat for me, and like I didn't know a single song on it, and I'm obsessed with like every single one. And I was like, I'm literally gonna cry right now. Like that is such a huge compliment.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. I can't imagine getting a more heartwarming if somebody told me that.
And it was like, I didn't even know she followed me on Spotify. I would never, like, if she was like, hey, I need some music recs, that would be one of like my bottom 3 of my own that I would probably recommend to her. And then for her to be like, oh, it like introduced me to a kind of new like genre of music, and like it's like my go-to. I was like, oh, like I rather you say it like that's like better than I love you. Like that is incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right. That's pretty great. I can't imagine anything better.
No.
But so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you as always.
Oh yeah, I'll see you in the morning.
I'll see you in the morning, bright and early.
Okay, bye.
Okay. Love you.
Love you, bye.